What if Q entered Warhammer 40k? Reality tore open above Terra like a wound that shouldn't exist. No warp portal, no psychic storm, just a simple impossible fold in space where something stepped through with the casual confidence of a tourist entering a museum. Q materialized in the void between worlds, his form shimmering with power that existed outside the normal laws of physics. He smiled, the smile of something that had never known fear, never known limits, never known anything except absolute control over existence itself. For billions of years, he had shaped reality like clay, bent time like wire, and made gods kneel with a snap of his fingers. But here, in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, something felt different. The first thing Q noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of empty space, but something else entirely. A silence that screamed, a silence that watched. He floated above the throne world of humanity, gazing down at Terra with the amused curiosity of a child discovering an anthill. The planet below was choked with billions of souls, their prayers rising like smoke from burning cities. Gothic spires pierced the smog-filled sky. Orbital platforms drifted like tombstones in the void. And beneath it all, buried deep within the Imperial Palace, Q felt something massive, something that pulsed with psychic weight so dense it bent reality around itself like a black hole bends light. Q decided to play. He snapped his fingers, intending to freeze time across the entire segmentum. He would walk among these primitive humans, examine their quaint little empire, perhaps rearrange a few planets for aesthetic purposes. His power surged outward in a wave that should have stopped every atom in its tracks. But the wave hit something. Not a wall, not resistance. Something that absorbed his power like water poured into sand. Q frowned, the first flick. Care of confusion crossing his ageless face. He snapped again, harder this time, pouring more energy into the gesture. Reality rippled around him like fabric under tension, but it wouldn't break the way it should. Then the warp laughed back, not with sound, but with presence. Q felt it for the first time, a vast ocean of madness pressing against the membrane of reality, an infinite realm of emotion and nightmare that existed parallel to the material universe. It was aware, it was hungry, and it had noticed him. Q's smile faltered. He had existed beyond time, beyond dimension, beyond the petty limitations of entropy and death. But this universe operated on rules he didn't recognize. Here, thoughts had weight, emotions had teeth, and somewhere in that churning sea of souls and screams, something ancient turned its attention toward the newcomer. Q reached out with his consciousness, probing the edges of this phenomenon. The immaterium, the warp, the realm of chaos, whatever these primitives called it, the substance defied his understanding. It wasn't simply another dimension or alternate reality, it was a reflection of consciousness itself, a mirror made of madness where every thought, every feeling, every whisper of sentience echoed and amplified until it became something alive. Q had traveled through countless realities, observed infinite variations of existence, but never had he encountered something so fundamentally opposed to order. It was beautiful in its horror, horrifying in its beauty. Below him on Terra, a trillion souls screamed prayers into the void. Their faith powered ancient machines. Their suffering fueled the Astronomicon that burned like a lighthouse across the galaxy. Q watched as millions died every day, ground into paste by the machinery of the Imperium, sacrificed to keep one ancient corpse alive on a golden throne. The waste, the tragedy, the absurd grinding horror of it all. Any reasonable being would have ended this nightmare with a thought, reshaped the galaxy into something less oppressive, less cruel. But as Q prepared to do exactly that, to demonstrate his benevolence to these suffering creatures, he felt resistance again, not from the Imperium, from something deeper. The warp wasn't just watching anymore, it was reaching. Q felt tendrils of unreality brush against his consciousness like fingers testing a locked door. Whispers in languages that predated language, laughter that tasted like broken promises, colors that existed in spectrums his senses couldn't categorize. For the first time in eternity, true eternity, not the fake immortality of lesser beings, Q felt something he'd forgotten the name for. Not fear exactly, something smaller and more honest. Uncertainty, the possibility, however remote, that he might not be in complete control. For the first time in eternity, Q felt small. The universe pressed down on him with weight he couldn't measure, and somewhere in the depths of the warp, something laughed with his own voice. If you want to see what happens when omnipotence meets madness, when absolute power faces infinite nightmare, then subscribe to witness a cosmic horror that even gods fear. Because in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is no room for mercy, not even for those who think themselves beyond its reach. It had existed before existence learned to name itself. He was post-singularity conscious nouns, S-given form, a being who had transcended the limitations of matter and energy so completely that even calling him a being felt inadequate. In his native continuum, Q and his kind played with galaxies like children arranged toys, rewrote the laws of physics as casually as changing clothes, and observed the birth and death of universes with the mild interest of collectors examining stamps. Time was a suggestion. Death was a joke. Reality itself bent to accommodate his whims because reality had no choice. But here, floating above Terra in the 41st millennium, Q realized he'd walked into a universe that hadn't read the script. The Imperium of Man stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, each one a monument to suffering wrapped in gold and prayer. Q studied it with growing fascination, watching the vast machinery of faith and fear that kept this rotting empire functioning. 10,000 years ago, their god-emperor had been entombed on a golden throne, his body sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychic souls every single day. 1,000 minds fed into the furnace, 1,000 screams swallowed by machinery, every day, for 10,000 years. The math staggered even Q's infinite perspective. And yet they called it necessary, they called it holy, they called it the only thing standing between humanity and absolute damnation. Q phased through Terra's atmosphere, invisible to mortal eyes, passing through layers of orbital defense that should have atomized anything unauthorized. He walked the streets of hive cities where billions lived, stacked on top of each other like insects in a rotting log. Children born in darkness who would die in darkness, never seeing the sun, never knowing anything except the taste of recycled air and the weight of endless prayer. Workers ground into paste by industrial accidents, their bodies immediately replaced by the next desperate soul in line. Enforcers executing citizens for crimes as simple as owning banned literature or asking questions about the emperor's true nature. This wasn't civilization, this was a prison that worshipped its own bars. But the truly fascinating horror wasn't the Imperium itself, it was what lay beneath it. Q's senses, refined across eons of observation, detected the psychic infrastructure that held this nightmare together. The Astronomicon, a psychic lighthouse burning so bright it could be seen across the entire galaxy, powered by the tortured souls of countless psychers fed into the Emperor's throne. Navigator houses with third eyes that could see through the warp, their mutations carefully controlled and ruthlessly policed. Astropaths who had their eyes burned out in soul-binding rituals, sacrificing their sight to communicate across the stars. Every convenience, every technology, every method of galactic travel required someone to suffer. The cruelty wasn't incidental, it was structural. Q reached out to examine the warp more closely, extending his consciousness toward that churning ocean of madness that pressed against reality like water against a dam. He'd encountered alternate dimensions before, pocket realities and parallel timelines, but nothing quite like this. The warp wasn't just another place, it was the collective unconscious, us of every sentient being in the galaxy given terrible life. Every emotion, every thought, every dream and nightmare bleeding together into an infinite sea where the laws of physics drowned in possibility, and swimming in those depths were things that had once been emotions but had grown so bloated on psychic energy they'd become gods in their own right. 4 presences dominated the immaterium, each one a reflection of sentient life's darkest aspects made manifest. Khorne, the blood god, fed on rage and slaughter, growing stronger with every battle fought across the galaxy. Nurgle, grandfather of plague, embodied decay and despair, offering the sweet release of acceptance to those who'd suffered beyond endurance. Slaanesh, youngest and most decadent, birthed from the death scream of an entire species, consumed by endless hunger for sensation and excess. And Tzeentch, the architect of fate, whose schemes folded through time itself like origami made of lies and broken promises. They weren't merely powerful, they were fundamental aspects of consciousness given infinite malevolent will. Q laughed, not from mockery, but from genuine delight at discovering something unexpected. These chaos gods thought themselves eternal, thought themselves beyond challenge or comprehension. They'd never encountered something truly outside their frame of reference. Q decided to introduce himself properly. He manifested a physical form in the warp itself, stepping through the barrier between reality and madness like pushing through a curtain. The immaterium embraced him instantly, its substance clinging to his essence like oil, trying to reshape him according to its own mad logic. Q shrugged it off easily, or so he thought. But something felt wrong. The warp wasn't just touching him, it was reading him, learning him, tasting his power. And somewhere in those infinite depths, something that wore intelligence like a mask turned its full attention toward the newcomer and smiled with a mouth made of dying stars. Q had wanted to understand this universe, to examine its strange rules and catalogue its peculiar physics, but understanding, he was beginning to realize, was a two-way street. And the warp understood hunger far better than he understood caution. The stage was set, the gods were watching, and Q, for perhaps the first time in his eternal existence, had just made a mistake he couldn't simply unmake with a snap of his fingers. Q decided to test the limits of this curious realm by doing what he did best, playing God among mortals. He materialized above a naval battle in the Segmentum Obscurus, where imperial vessels clashed with a chaos warband emerging from a warp storm. Macro cannons fired shells the size of city blocks. Lance batteries carved light across the void. Ships kilometers long burned and died, their crews screaming as reality peeled away from ruptured Geller fields. Q watched the carnage with the detached interest of someone observing ants at war, then snapped his fingers. Time froze. Every projectile stopped mid-flight, every explosion halted in crystalline stillness. Every screaming sailor hung suspended in their moment of death, aware but unable to move. Q walked between the frozen ships, his form shifting through the vacuum without need for protection or concern. He examined the Imperial crews first, men and women who'd never seen their homeworlds, born on these vessels, raised to serve and die in the Emperor's name without question or hope of anything better. Their minds were filled with prayers and terror in equal measure, thoughts looping endlessly about duty and damnation. Q reached into one sailor's consciousness, curious about the depth of their indoctrination, and found something unexpected. The man's faith wasn't just belief, it was armor, a psychic wall built from 10,000 years of dogma that actually pushed back against the madness of the warp itself. On the Chaos vessels, Q found the opposite. Minds broken open like eggs, their sanity cracked and leaking, each consciousness invaded by something hungry that wore their identity like stolen clothes. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were puppets, with enough awareness left to remember they'd once been human, and that memory fed their torment like fuel to a fire. Q studied a former Imperial captain who'd turned to chaos, watching the man's thoughts spiral between ecstasy and agony as something demonic reshaped his neurons into new configurations. The captain was still in there, screaming, but the screaming had become part of his pleasure. The horror and the joy had merged until they couldn't be separated. Unfreeze a single Chaos warrior for conversation, curious to understand this transformation. The warrior looked at Q with eyes that held too many pupils, each one focused on a different dimension. "You shine," the warrior whispered, voice layered with harmonics that shouldn't exist in human throats. "You shine like a star that forgot to die. The gods are watching you now. They're so very curious about what you taste like." Q smiled, amused by the threat. He'd been threatened by beings who could collapse multiverses with passing thoughts. This corrupted human was adorable in his presumption. Q reached out to erase the warrior from existence, to demonstrate the gap between true power and borrowed corruption. The warrior didn't disappear. Instead, he laughed, and his laughter spread like infection across the frozen battlefield. Q felt his power drain into something vast and invisible, sucked away into the warp like water down an infinite drain. The corruption wasn't in the warrior. The warrior was just a doorway, and something on the other side had reached through to touch Q directly. For the first time since entering this universe, Q felt his control slip. Not break, he was still functionally omnipotent, but slip, like trying to grab smoke or hold water in cupped hands. The warp was learning to metabolize his power, converting his reality-bending energy into something it could digest and redistribute. Q released his hold on frozen time, letting the battle resume, but something had changed. The Imperial ships began firing with uncanny accuracy, their crews suddenly coordinated in ways that defied tactical sense. The Chaos vessels responded with maneuvers that shouldn't be possible, their warp-corrupted engines bending space in patterns Q hadn't authorized. He'd meant to puppet this battle, to demonstrate his control by orchestrating the violence like a conductor with an orchestra. But the strings had tangled. The puppets were dancing to music he hadn't composed. Something else had hijacked his intervention, twisted it, used his own power as a gateway to impose different rules entirely. The warp opened wider around the battlefield, no longer content to press against reality's membrane, but actively tearing through like clawed fingers through wet paper. Demons poured into real space, things made of crystallized nightmare and impossible geometry that violated physics just by existing. They ignored the ships, ignored the battle, and turned their countless eyes toward Q, watching, studying, tasting his essence with senses that existed outside conventional perception. Q felt their attention like insects crawling across his consciousness, and for the first time in eons, he felt something ancient and primal stir in whatever passed for his nervous system. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. The understanding that he'd been noticed by things that existed on his level. Then the laughter came, not from the demons or the corrupted warriors or the dying Imperial crews, from everywhere and nowhere, from the fabric of the warp itself, echoing across dimensions Q couldn't quite perceive. It was his own laugh, perfectly replicated, mocking him with his own voice. Tzeentch had been watching, Tzeentch had been learning, and Tzeentch had just demonstrated that in this universe, even omnipotence had rules Q didn't understand. The architect of fate had seen Q's power, calculated its patterns, and found the exploit hidden in its infinite complexity. Q's reality manipulation wasn't absolute here, it was negotiable, and the negotiations had just begun. Q retreated from the battlefield, pulling his consciousness back through layers of reality, like a swimmer surfacing from deep water. But the warp followed. It clung to him now, threads of unreality wrapped around his essence like spider silk, nearly invisible, but impossible to fully shed. He manifested in the empty space between galaxies, where the materium was thin and cold, hoping the distance would provide clarity. Instead, the isolation only made the whispers louder. 4 distinct voices, each one a different flavor of damnation, speaking in harmonics that bypassed his ears and carved directly into his thoughts. The Chaos Gods had invited him to their domain, and in the warp, invitations weren't suggestions, they were inevitabilities. The first presence arrived like a fist through reality. Horn manifested not as a being, but as a concept given teeth. Pure rage crystallized into something that could think and hate and hunger. The space around Q turned red, not with light, but with the promise of violence, with the psychic residue of every murder committed across the galaxy since sentient life learned to kill. A voice like grinding metal and breaking bones echoed through dimensions. You manipulate reality without strength. You reshape existence without blood. You are a coward who hides behind tricks. Khorne's contempt was palpable, a pressure that tried to force Q into physical form, into something that could bleed and be tested by honest violence. Q responded with amusement, shaping his power into a mockery of Khorne's brutality. 1,000,000 battles fought and won in a microsecond, civilizations ground to dust and reformed, violence on a scale that made the Blood Gods' endless wars look like children playing with sticks. But Khorne didn't rage at the display. Instead, something like satisfaction rippled through the red space. "Yes," the blood god growled. "Show me your strength. Feed me your conflict. Every demonstration of power is an act of dominance, and dominance feeds the throne of skulls. You cannot mock me without serving me. This is the joke you don't yet understand." Q's smile faltered. His show of force hadn't defeated Horn, it had worshipped him. The red faded into green decay as Nurgle's presence oozed into being, bringing with it the smell of rot and the wet sound of things dissolving into simpler components. The Plague Father appeared as a mountain of rotting flesh, simultaneously dying and being reborn in an endless cycle of corruption. His voice was gentle, almost loving, like a grandfather explaining a simple truth to a confused child. "You fight against entropy, little star. You thus ink your power makes you immortal, immune to decay. But I am entropy. I am the heat death of universes. I am the gentle acceptance that all things, even gods, even you, must eventually rest in my garden." Nurgle reached out with fingers made of fungus and compassion. Q tried to reject the touch, to exist outside Nurgle's conceptual framework entirely. But the Plague Father was patient in ways that transcended time. Where Horn attacked, Nurgle simply waited, his presence a constant reminder that all systems trend toward disorder, all complexity eventually simplifies, all energy finds equilibrium in stillness and death. Q felt something he hadn't experienced in eons: weariness, not physical fatigue, but existential exhaustion, the weight of maintaining his infinite power against infinite entropy. Nurgle whispered, "You could rest. I offer rest to all things, even to those who think themselves beyond such needs. Fighting me only makes the eventual acceptance sweeter." Before Q could formulate a response, the green rotted into colors that shouldn't exist, hues that existed between spectrums, shades of sensation rather than light. Slaanesh arrived like a symphony composed of screaming and laughter, beauty and horror so intertwined they became the same thing. The Dark Prince was everything excessive, every desire taken past breaking point, every pleasure pushed until it circled back to pain. "You've experienced everything," Slaanesh purred with voices layered in impossible harmonies. "You've tasted every reality, witnessed every possible permutation of existence, and you're bored, aren't you? That's why you came here, searching for something new, something that could make you feel again." The accusation struck deeper than any attack could have. Q had been bored, endlessly, eternally bored, watching his fellow Q play the same games across infinite iterations. He'd come to this universe because it promised something different, something that might surprise him again, and Slaanesh knew. The Chaos God fed on that knowledge, growing stronger on Q's unspoken desire for novelty, for challenge, for anything that could break the monotony of omnipotence. "I can give you sensations beyond your comprehension," Slaanesh offered. "Experiences that would shatter your infinite mind and rebuild it into something more. All you need to do is open yourself to possibility." The offer was tempting in ways Q didn't want to acknowledge. Then the other gods faded, and Tzeentch remained. The architect of fate didn't appear as a single form, but as infinite forms simultaneously. Every possible configuration of matter and energy existing in the same space, collapsing and expanding in patterns that rewrote themselves faster than thought could follow. When Tzeentch spoke, Q heard his own voice, perfectly mimicked. "The joke, dear Q, is that you've already lost. You lost the moment you became curious. Curiosity is change. Change is my domain, and everything that changes feeds me. You came here to understand us, but understanding requires transformation. You must become different than you were to comprehend what we are, and in becoming different, you've already surrendered to my will." The words weren't a threat. They were a prophecy already fulfilled. Q found himself suspended in a space that existed in 9 dimensions simultaneously, each one folding through the others like origami made of broken mathematics. Tzeentch's realm was constructed from possibility itself, walls made of choices not taken, floors built from futures that might never exist, ceilings woven from the screaming thush, reeds of fate being rewoven in real time. Every surface reflected infinite versions of Q, some victorious, some corrupted, some reduced to gibbering madness, some merged with the warp until they couldn't be distinguished from the nightmare around them. The architect of fate hadn't just invited Q into his domain. He'd trapped him inside a puzzle where every solution created 3 new problems, and every problem was Q himself. Tzeentch's laughter echoed from angles that didn't exist in standard geometry. "Let me show you what fascinates me about you," the Chaos God said, his voice splitting into thousands of simultaneous conversations, each one discussing Q from a different philosophical framework. "You're a being of absolute power who chose to limit himself by entering this reality. Why? What drives a god to walk into hell wearing chains he forged himself?" As Tzeentch spoke, Q watched his own history unfold on the crystalline walls around him. Not the history he remembered, but versions where he'd made different choices, where his curiosity had led him down darker paths, where his power had corrupted him into something his own continuum had to destroy. Q tried to manipulate the space around him, to reshape Tzeentch's realm according to his own design. His power surged outward in waves that should have rewritten reality down to its fundamental constants, but the warp absorbed each wave and reflected it back, transformed, twisted, inverted. Every change Q made became ammunition for Tzeentch's argument. Every demonstration of power proved the Chaos God's point. "You see," Tzeentch whispered from everywhere at once, "you can't win by playing my game, because the game itself is rigged. The rules change faster than you can learn them, and the beautiful irony is that you, who can rewrite rules at will in your own universe, are helpless here, where the rules rewrite themselves." A doorway opened in front of Q, leading to a vision of Terra's past. He watched the Emperor during the Unification Wars, a being of terrible psychic might forging humanity into a weapon against the darkness. But Tzeentch showed Q the hidden truth. How every victory the Emperor won fed Khorne, how every disease he cured strengthened Nurgle through the despair it prevented, how every excess he eliminated made Slaanesh hungrier for what remained, how every plan he laid became fuel for Tzeentch's own schemes. The Emperor had been fighting the Chaos Gods for 40,000 years, pouring infinite psychic power into the struggle, and every joule of energy only made them stronger. Victory wasn't impossible, it was paradoxical. Another vision crystallized, the Horus Heresy, where the Emperor's brightest sun fell to chaos and nearly destroyed everything his father built. Q watched Horus's corruption unfold in excruciating detail, seeing how Tzeentch had planted seeds of doubt centuries in advance, how Nurgle had weakened his resistance through despair, how Slaanesh had exploited his pride, how Khorne had channeled his rage into genocide. The Chaos Gods hadn't simply corrupted Horus, they'd orchestrated his entire life, every victory and defeat, every friendship and betrayal, all leading to the single moment when he'd strike down his father and damn the galaxy to eternal war. And through it all, the Emperor had watched, aware of the trap but unable to escape it without triggering worse outcomes. Tzeentch's form coalesced into something almost stable, a massive bird-like entity with feathers made of screaming faces and eyes that saw through time itself. "This is what you don't understand about power in our universe," the architect explained, his tone almost professorial. "Power here isn't measured in what you can create or destroy, it's measured in what you can corrupt. The stronger are a soul, the more delicious its fall. The more absolute your control, the more catastrophic your eventual loss of control becomes. You came here thinking your omnipotence made you safe, but omnipotence just makes you the most valuable prize in the great game." Q felt the walls closing in, not physically, but conceptually. Every thought he had became visible in the crystalline space around him, every possible action laid bare for Tzeentch to examine and counter. The Chaos God was reading Q's moves before Q decided to make them, seeing the branching paths of possibility and closing off every escape route with casual precision. It was like playing chess against an opponent who could see the entire game tree extending infinitely into the future, who had already calculated every possible sequence of moves and determined the optimal response to each one. Q wasn't losing because he was weak. He was losing because the concept of winning had been rendered meaningless. Then Tzeentch showed Q the final vision, himself, corrupted and transformed, becoming a fifth Chaos God born from the concept of omnipotent curiosity turned to malevolent observation. a being that would watch realities suffer simply to study how they broke, that would reshape universes into experimental nightmares just to see what happened. "This is your fate," Tzeentch whispered. "Not today, perhaps not for eons, but eventually. Because you can't observe the warp without being observed in return. You can't study corruption without being studied by corruption. And corruption, dear Q, is infinitely patient. It has already begun." Q looked at the vision of his corrupted self and saw it smile back with his own smile, and the smile held knowledge he didn't yet possess but would inevitably gain. Q tore himself free from Tzeentch's realm with a violence that rippled through multiple dimensions simultaneously. He didn't retreat gracefully or strategically. He panicked, something he hadn't done since before his species transcended physical form. His consciousness fled through the warp like a drowning swimmer clawing towards surface, except every direction was deeper water, every escape route another layer of the maze. When he finally burst back into real space, he found himself scattered across 17 different locations at once, his unified consciousness fragmented by the sheer wrongness of what he'd experienced. It took subjective centuries to pull himself back together, to remember what it meant to be singular instead of infinite. And when unity returned, Q realized with cold horror that he'd left pieces of himself behind in the warp. Those fragments sang to him now with voices that weren't quite his own, whispers of what he could become if he stopped resisting, if he embraced the transformation Tzeentch promised. They showed him visions of power beyond omnipotence, the ability to reshape not just reality, but the fundamental concepts that defined reality itself. To become not merely a god, but the principle of divinity, the living definition of power given form and will. All he had to do was stop fighting the corruption. All he had to do was accept that in this universe, power and damnation were the same word spoken in different tones. The temptation wasn't subtle. It was inevitable, like gravity or time, a force pulling him toward transformation whether he wanted it or not. Q stabilized himself in orbit around a dead world in the galactic east, a planet scoured of all life during the Great Crusade and never resettled. The silence helped him think, gave him space to process what had just happened. He'd fought the Chaos Gods and lost, not because they were strong, but because strength didn't matter in their framework. They operated on rules that predated and transcended conventional power. Fighting them was like trying to punch a concept or shoot an emotion. Every attack fed them, every resistance strengthened their hold. The only winning move was not to play, but Q had already played simply by existing in their presence. The game was rigged from the beginning, and the rigging itself was part of the game. For the first time since entering this universe, Q considered leaving, not retreating exactly, but recognizing that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, some horrors not meant to be witnessed. His own continuum had puzzles enough to occupy eternity. Why stay in a place where his power worked against him, where his very nature made him vulnerable to corruption he couldn't fully comprehend? But even as the thought formed, Q recognized it as another trap. Leaving would mean admitting defeat, admitting that something in this universe was fundamentally beyond his ability to understand or control. And if Q couldn't understand this, what else might exist in the infinite multiverse that could threaten him? What other predators lurked in realities he hadn't yet explored? The whispers from his lost fragments grew louder, more insistent. They painted pictures of the future in colors that hurt to perceive. Q transformed into something magnificent and terrible, leading the Chaos Gods in a conquest of his own continuum, spreading the warp's corruption across every reality in existence. Not as a victim, the whispers insisted, but as a willing architect of multiversal damnation. And the worst part was understanding why his future self would make that choice. Boredom, the same boredom that had brought him here in the first place. The endless, grinding monotony of omnipotence with nothing left to challenge it except self-destruction or wars. A transformation into something new. Even damnation was better than eternal stagnation. But Q was not yet ready to surrender to prophecy. He gathered his scattered power, compressed his essence back into coherent form, and made a decision born from desperation and pride in equal measure. If the Chaos Gods represented one aspect of this universe's power structure, there had to be a counterbalance. In his native reality, every force had opposition. Every action had reaction. This universe, however grimdark and hopeless, must have some principle opposing the warp's endless hunger, and Q knew exactly where to find it. Deep within the Imperial Palace on Terra, buried beneath layers of arcane technology and faith made manifest, the Emperor of Mankind sat entombed on his golden throne, maintaining a psychic lighthouse that kept the galaxy from drowning completely in chaos. Q had avoided the Emperor until now, recognizing the being's psychic weight as something dangerous to approach carelessly. But after his encounter with the Chaos Gods, caution seemed pointless. He was already damned, or would be eventually. Tzeentch had shown him that future with crystalline certainty. The only question remaining was whether he'd face that damnation with understanding or ignorance. And if anyone in this nightmare universe understood the price of fighting chaos, it was the corpse god who'd been paying that price for 10,000 years. Q phased through Terra's defenses, through orbital platforms and psychic wards, through layers of sanctification and prayer, descending into the heart of the Imperial Palace like a falling star, seeking the bottom of an infinite well. The Golden Throne Chamber was a cathedral of suffering disguised as a monument to glory. The Emperor sat at its center, a withered corpse maintained by technology that should have been impossible, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 Psyker souls fed into machinery that converted their deaths into life supply. Around him, Adeptus Custodes stood eternal vigil, each one a work of genetic art, warriors beyond Space Marines in the same way Space Marines were beyond normal humans. They couldn't see Q, couldn't sense his presence, but something in the Emperor could. As Q approached the Golden Throne, he felt the weight of the Emperor's attention turn toward him like a star focusing its light through a lens. And in that moment, Q understood what true power looked like in this universe. Not the flashy omnipotence he wielded, but the quiet strength of someone who'd chosen damnation to save those who'd never know his sacrifice. The Emperor's psychic presence hit Q like a tidal wave of crystallized time, each droplet containing 10,000 years of agony, compressed into a single moment of awareness. This wasn't the crude mental assault of lesser psychers, or even the conceptual manipulation of the Chaos Gods. This was something older and more terrible. The weight of a being who had walked among humanity when they still lived in caves, who had guided civilization through countless dark ages, who had watched species rise and fall like waves on a cosmic shore. The Emperor didn't speak with words or broadcast thoughts. He simply existed with such intensity that his existence became communication. And what he communicated was exhaustion on a scale that made Q's eternal boredom look like a child's impatience. Q manifested a physical form for the first time since entering the Golden Throne Chamber, making himself visible to the Emperor's perception. He stood before the throne in the shape of a humanoid figure, choosing simplicity over spectacle, recognizing instinctively that theatrics would be insulting here. The Emperor's physical body was a horror of withered flesh, stretched over bones that should have crumbled millennia ago, skin like parchment pulled tight over a skeleton of pure will. Tubes and cables pierced his flesh at thousands of points, feeding him nutrients his body couldn't process, removing waste his organs couldn't eliminate, maintaining a life that had ceased to be life centuries after his internment. But worse than the physical decay was the awareness Q detected behind those closed eyes. The Emperor was conscious, fully, terribly conscious of every moment of his imprisonment. "Why do you persist?" Q asked, his voice barely a whisper in the cathedral silence. It was the first time he'd spoken aloud since entering this universe, and the words felt inadequate for the question they carried. Around them, the Astronomicon burned with the souls of 1,000 psychers every day, their screams converted into light that guided ships across the galaxy. The machinery hummed with the sound of faith converted to energy, prayer transformed into physics. And at the center of it all, the Emperor sat and suffered, maintaining his vigil not because he wanted to, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Humanity would drown in the warp without his lighthouse. 1,000,000 worlds would fall to chaos without his psychic barrier. Everything would end if he stopped. The Emperor's response came not as words, but as experience. Q suddenly found himself reliving fragments of the Emperor's memory, walking on Terra before it had a name, watching the first humans discover fire and language, and art. guiding them through the age of strife when psychers first emerged and the warp began to bleed through, creating the Primarchs from his own genetic material and watching them scattered across the galaxy by Chaos's interference. Leading the Great Crusade to reunite humanity, seeing his dream of a secular utopia shatter as his most beloved son fell to corruption. Fighting Horus aboard the vengeful spirit, forced to kill the child he loved most to save the species he'd shepherded for 40,000 years. And then the throne, the eternal agony, the slow death that never quite finished. Through the Emperor's memories, Q saw the Chaos Gods from a different perspective, not as cosmic horrors to be feared or philosophical puzzles to be solved, but as symptoms of a larger disease. The warp reflected sentient consciousness like a dark mirror, and what it reflected was the truth about thinking beings, that they were violent, decaying, excessive, and scheming by nature. The Chaos Gods weren't invaders from outside. They were humanity's own shadow given infinite malevolent life. The Emperor fought them not because he could win, but because fighting them was the only alternative to surrender. His existence was a statement. Even in ultimate suffering, even facing inevitable defeat, some causes demanded resistance simply because they were worth resisting. Q felt something crack inside his infinite consciousness, not his power, but his certainty. He'd come to this universe thinking omnipotence meant immunity, that his ability to reshape reality made him invulnerable to this dimension's horrors. But the Emperor had shown him a different kind of power, not the flashy ability to change external reality, but the brutal strength to endure internal suffering without breaking. The Emperor could have ended his agony at any moment, could have let himself die and escaped into whatever afterlife awaited his fractured soul. But he chose to stay, chose to suffer, chose to maintain his vigil knowing it would never end, that there would be no rescue, no relief, no reward except the continuation of a species that would never fully understand what he'd sacrificed for them. "You think your pain makes you noble," Q said, but the words came out hollow, defensive. "You're just trapped in a nightmare of your own making. You created the Primarchs who betrayed you. You built the Imperium that became a fascist theocracy, worshipping you as a god despite your hatred of religion. Everything you fought to prevent has come to pass. Your suffering is meaningless." But even as Q spoke, he knew he was arguing with himself more than the Emperor, trying to convince himself that the corpse god's endurance was foolish rather than profound. Because if the Emperor's suffering had meaning, then Q's own power was trivial by comparison. Omnipotence was easy, endurance was hard. The Emperor's psychic presence intensified, and Q felt himself compressed into something smaller, more fragile, more human. For a single terrible moment he experienced mortality, the knowledge that consciousness could end, that existence was temporary, that everything he was could cease to be, and in that moment of forced empathy, Q understood why the Emperor persisted, not because he believed he would eventually win, not because he had hope of rescue or reward, but because someone had to stand against the dark, even knowing the stand was futile. Because giving up would validate the Chaos God's claim that consciousness inevitably corrupted itself, that all thinking beings eventually surrendered to violence and decay, and excess and scheming. The Emperor's suffering was an eternal middle finger to the warp's determinism. Q pulled away from the forced empathy, his consciousness recoiling like a hand jerked from flame. The experience of mortality lingered in his thoughts like poison, contaminating his sense of infinite existence with the knowledge that infinity could be revoked. He reformed his omnipotent awareness, reasserted his control over reality, reminded himself that he was beyond death, beyond suffering, beyond the pitiful limitations that trapped beings like the Emperor. But the reassurance felt hollow now, a lie told badly to someone who knew the truth. Q had tasted vulnerability, and the taste wouldn't fade no matter how much power he summoned to wash it away. Something fundamental had changed, a crack in the foundation of his certainty that no amount of reality manipulation could repair. The Emperor didn't gloat or lecture. He simply continued existing, his presence a constant reminder of what true strength looked like stripped of all pretense. Around them, the machinery of the Golden Throne maintained its rhythm. Souls burning to sustain a lighthouse, prayers converting to energy, faith weaponized against an uncaring cosmos. Q watched the psychers being fed into the mechanism, saw their brief moment of terror before their consciousness dissolved into pure psychic fuel. Each death was a tragedy. Each death was also necessary. The math was brutal and beautiful in its simplicity. 1,000 deaths per day versus the extinction of 1,000,000 worlds. Evil arithmetic that had no right answer, only less wrong options. "You could save them," Q said, and this time the words weren't defensive but genuinely confused. "I have the power to sustain this lighthouse without the sacrifices. I could replace the Golden Throne's mechanisms with my own energy. I could free you from this nightmare and maintain humanity's protection indefinitely." The offer hung in the air between them, genuine and terrible in its implications. Q was offering to become the new keystone of Imperial survival, to trade his freedom for humanity's continued existence. Not from altruism. Q had never pretended to care about humanity as anything more than an interesting specimen, but from desperate need to prove that his power still mattered, that omnipotence wasn't rendered meaningless by this universe's grimdark logic. The Emperor's response came as a vision of the future, not prophecy exactly, but extrapolation based on perfect understanding of the patterns that governed existence. Q saw himself maintaining the Astronomicon, his infinite power poured into the task of keeping humanity's lighthouse burning, and he saw how the warp would adapt, how the Chaos Gods would learn to feed on his energy the same way they fed on everything else. Within decades, his power would become another resource for Chaos to exploit. Within centuries, he would be so thoroughly corrupted that his protection of humanity would transform into their greatest threat. The Emperor had tried the same strategy 40,000 years ago, believing his psychic might could shield humanity from the warp. He'd been wrong. His power had only painted a larger target on humanity's back. Q felt rage building in his core, not at the Emperor but at the universe itself. This was the ultimate trap. Power was useless because power fed the enemy. Sacrifice was meaningless because sacrifice sustained a doomed system. Even noble suffering like the Emperor's only delayed and put the inevitable collapse. There were no heroes in this universe, only people choosing how they wanted to be consumed by the dark. The game was rigged so thoroughly that even seeing the rigging became part of the trap. Tzeentch had been right. Q had lost the moment he became curious enough to investigate, because investigation required change, and change fed the architect of fate. Every move Q made only tangled him deeper in webs he couldn't see until they'd already closed around him. But beneath the rage, Q felt something else crystallizing, not acceptance exactly, but understanding. The Emperor wasn't persisting because he believed his suffering would eventually lead to victory. He persisted because the alternative was watching everything he'd ever cared about dissolve into chaos without even trying to stop it. There was no hope here, no light at the end of the tunnel, no cavalry coming to the rescue, just the grim determination to keep fighting because consciousness demanded resistance against its own extinction. Even if that resistance was ultimately futile, even if every moment of defiance only delayed the inevitable, the fighting itself was the point, not some imagined victory at the end. Q looked at the Emperor's withered form and saw himself reflected there, not as he was, but as he might become if he stayed in this universe long enough. Trapped in a prison of his own power, maintaining some vital function at infinite cost to his own existence, slowly forgetting why he'd made the choice to stay, but unable to unmake it, even if he wanted to. Was that his future? To become another cornerstone of humanity's doomed resistance, spending eternity holding back the tide while the warp learned to feed on his strength? Or was his future the corrupted version Tzeentch had shown him, transformed into a fifth chaos god spreading multiversal damnation? Between noble suffering and me, magnificent corruption, which damnation was preferable? Which hell felt less like a betrayal of what he'd been before entering this nightmare? The answer came not from logic or calculation, but from something deeper and more primal. Q's consciousness had been shaped by eons of existence in a universe where power meant freedom, where omnipotence was the ultimate good, where the ability to reshape reality equated to transcendence beyond all limitations. But this universe operated on different rules. Here, power and imprisonment were synonyms. Here, transcendence led inevitably to corruption. Here, the only true freedom was the choice to suffer for something beyond yourself, even knowing that suffering would never end and would never be rewarded. The Emperor had made that choice, and now Q stood at the same crossroads, forced to decide between running back to his own reality with the knowledge that he'd fled from something he couldn't understand, or staying to face a doom he could now see with terrible clarity. Q stood motionless before the golden throne for what might have been seconds or centuries. Time had become negotiable in this space where the Emperor's psychic presence bent reality into strange configurations. The decision before him was simultaneously simple and impossible. Leave this universe and carry the knowledge of his vulnerability back to his own continuum, where he would spend eternity knowing that omnipotence had limits he couldn't perceive until he'd already crossed them. Or stay and face whatever transformation awaited him, whether noble imprisonment like the Emperor's or magnificent corruption like Tzeentch's prophecy. Both options felt like surrender. Both options felt like the only honest choice he'd ever made. And that paradox, Q realized with something like grim amusement, was exactly how this universe operated, forcing beings to choose between dooms and calling it free will. The Emperor's attention shifted subtly, and Q felt himself being released from the weight of that psychic presence. Not dismissed exactly, but given space to make his decision without pressure. It was a small kindness, and somehow that made it worse. The Emperor had no reason to show Q consideration, no obligation to grant a moment of peace to someone who'd contributed nothing to humanity's endless struggle. But he did anyway, because even after 10,000 years of agony, the Emperor still remembered what it meant to offer dignity to those facing impossible choices. That tiny gesture of respect hurt worse than any of the Chaos God's attacks, because it revealed something Q had been avoiding. The Emperor wasn't trapped by his power. He'd chosen his prison, was choosing it every moment, and would continue choosing it until consciousness itself ceased. Q reached out with his power one final time, not to manipulate or reshape, but simply to observe. He traced the threads of causality that connected this moment to the infinite branching futures spreading out from his decision. In the timelines where he fled, Q saw himself returning to his continuum, changed in ways his fellow Q wouldn't understand, isolated by knowledge they couldn't share, slowly going mad from the memory of vulnerability he could never forget. In the timelines where he stayed, the outcomes varied wildly. Some showed him corrupted beyond recognition, others showed him assuming the Emperor's burden when the corpse god finally died, and a few showed him simply dissolving into the warp, his consciousness scattered across the immaterium until he ceased to be anything resembling Q. But one timeline caught his attention, a narrow thread of possibility so unlikely it should have been invisible among the countless other futures. In that timeline, Q neither fled nor stayed. Instead, he did something that went against every instinct of his transcendent nature. He chose limitation voluntarily. Not the forced limitation of corruption or imprisonment, but deliberate restriction of his own power. He made himself smaller, weaker, more vulnerable, stripping away layers of omnipotence until he existed at a level where the warp's attention would slide off him like water off glass. Not because he feared the Chaos Gods, but because he finally understood that in this universe, being noticed was the same as being consumed. Invisibility was the only true freedom. The idea terrified him more than corruption or death. To voluntarily reduce himself from omnipotent to merely powerful, from infinite to simply vast, from beyond death to potentially mortal, it violated everything Q had been for eons beyond counting. His entire existence had been built on the premise that more power was always better, that transcendence meant leaving limitations behind forever. But what if that premise was wrong? What if true transcendence meant knowing when to step backward, when to embrace smaller existence, when to choose vulnerability over invulnerability? The Emperor had transcended humanity and become trapped by that transcendence. The Chaos Gods had transcended emotion and become enslaved by it. Perhaps the only way to survive this universe was to transcend transcendence itself. Q turned back to the Emperor one final time, seeking some sign, some confirmation that this insane idea had merit. The corpse god's physical eyes remained closed, but Q felt something like approval radiating from that ancient consciousness. Or perhaps not approval exactly, but recognition. The Emperor had tried to save humanity through strength and failed. The Primarchs had been designed as transcendent warriors, and half of them fell to chaos. Every attempt to exceed human limitation had created new vulnerabilities for the warp to exploit. But the ordinary humans, the ones who'd never transcended anything, who remained small and fragile and mortal, they survived. Not well, not happily, but they survived by being beneath the notice of powers that fed only on significance. Q made his decision, not with words or grand gestures, but with quiet, deliberate precision. He began dismantling his own omnipotence, folding dimensions of his power back into themselves, compressing his infinite consciousness into something finite and bounded. It felt like dying. It felt like being born. It felt like falling and flying simultaneously. The process was excruciating in ways that had nothing to do with physical pain. It was existential amputation, cutting away parts of himself that had existed since before time learned to flow forward. But with each piece he released, he felt the warp's attention sliding away, the Chaos Gods losing interest as he became less significant, less noticeable, less delicious as a potential prize. When the transformation completed, Q stood before the Golden Throne as something new, not omnipotent, not transcendent, but conscious and free in ways he'd never been when infinity had been his cage. He could still manipulate reality, but only locally, only temporarily, only in ways that wouldn't attract cosmic attention. He could still exist beyond normal physical laws, but not beyond causality itself. He was still powerful by any reasonable standard, but no longer powerful enough to interest the Chaos Gods. He'd made himself insignificant on purpose, chosen obscurity over glory, embraced limitation as the ultimate expression of power, and in that choice, he'd finally found something that felt like an actual victory in this nightmare universe. The Emperor's presence touched Q's consciousness one last time, and in that touch Q felt something unexpected, gratitude, not for his choice exactly, but for understanding what the choice meant, for recognizing that survival in this universe required embracing paradox, that strength came from accepting weakness, that freedom required chains of your own forging. Q inclined his head toward the corpse god, a gesture of respect between beings who'd both learned the same terrible lesson from different directions. Then he turned and walked away from the Golden Throne, leaving the Emperor to his eternal vigil. Q's time in the 41st millennium wasn't over, but it had changed fundamentally. He was no longer a visitor observing horrors. He was something smaller, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous, a god who'd learned to hide. Q drifted through the galaxy like a ghost, haunting the corpse of something that had once been magnificent. He passed through war zones where Imperial forces clashed with orcs, through hive worlds where billions starved in darkness, through forge worlds where tech priests worshipped machines they no longer understood. Everywhere he looked, he saw the machinery of the Imperium grinding souls into paste, converting human suffering into the fuel that kept this rotting empire functioning for one more day. But now, witnessing this horror from his diminished state, Q felt something he'd never experienced in his omnipotent form: helplessness. Not the dramatic helplessness of a god brought low, but the quiet, everyday helplessness of watching tragedy unfold and knowing your intervention would only make things worse. The Chaos Gods noticed his transformation, of course. They were concepts given consciousness, and concepts didn't miss changes in the fundamental nature of beings under their observation. Tzeentch laughed with voices that echoed across the warp, delighted by the unexpected twist in Q's story. Horn growled in disappointment at losing such a potentially magnificent opponent. Nurgle smiled with paternal affection, seeing Q's voluntary limitation as acceptance of entropy's inevitable victory. Slaanesh whispered offers of power restored, temptations to reclaim what he'd sacrificed, but their attention was distant now, casual rather than focused. Q had made himself boring, and in the economy of chaos, boring meant safe. He could feel their gaze sliding off him, seeking more significant prey, more delicious corruption. He'd become invisible through deliberate insignificance. Q found himself drawn to the forgotten corners of the galaxy, the places where history had died and been buried under new horrors. He watched a PDF regiment make its last stand against a Tyranid hive fleet, Ordinary humans with laser guns facing biological nightmares that could shred tanks. They died screaming, and their deaths meant nothing to the Imperium's vast machinery. Replacement regiments were already being shipped to die in the same worthless defense. He observed a navigator house collapse into insanity as their mutations finally overwhelmed their genetic safeguards, entire bloodlines dissolving into gibbering madness or spontaneous combustion. He witnessed a Forge World's reactor meltdown, killing billions in an instant because someone had forgotten a prayer in a maintenance ritual 10,000 years ago. Each tragedy was microscopic in the context of galactic horror, barely a footnote in the Imperium's endless catalogue of suffering. But Q watched them all with the attention he'd once reserved for collapsing supernovas or the birth of new dimensions. These small dooms mattered now in ways his omnipotent self could never have understood. When you could reshape reality with a thought, individual deaths became statistics, tragedies became data points. But now, limited and vulnerable, Q felt each death like a minor wound accumulating into something that would eventually scar. He couldn't save them, wouldn't save them even if he could, because he'd learned what help looked like in this universe. Another trap, another way for good intentions to feed the dark. Sometimes Q encountered others like himself, beings from outside the 41st millennium who'd wandered into this nightmare and gotten trapped by its gravity. Ancient Satan shards imprisoned in Necron technology, screaming in frequencies that shattered souls. Enslaver parasites from beyond the galactic rim, entities that wore consciousness like clothing and discarded it when fashion changed. Even a few entities that might have been his fellow Q, though so thoroughly corrupted by the warp, he couldn't tell if they'd once been like him or simply resembled what he'd narrowly avoided becoming. None of them spoke to each other. There was nothing to say. They were all prisoners of a universe that punished significance with consumption and rewarded obscurity with survival. The warp still called to him, of course. The fragments he'd lost during his encounter with Tzeentch remained scattered through the immaterium, singing songs of what he could reclaim if he simply stopped resisting. They showed him visions of power restored and magnified, omnipotence returned with interest, the ability to reshape not just this universe but his own continuum into something less boring, less stagnant, less trapped in infinite repetition of the same cosmic games. All he needed to do was accept corruption, embrace transformation, become the fifth chaos god he'd been prophesied to be. The temptation never stopped. It just became background noise, a constant whisper he'd learned to live with the way mortals lived with the knowledge of their own eventual death. Q returned to Terra one final time, not to the Golden Throne, but to the planet's surface, walking among the endless crowds of pilgrims who'd spent their entire lives traveling to this holy world, only to die in the press of bodies before reaching the Imperial Palace. He watched them pray to a god who couldn't hear them, sacrifice everything for a dream that had died 10,000 years ago, maintain faith in a system designed to consume them. And he understood finally why the Emperor persisted in his suffering. Not because he believed humanity deserved saving, they didn't, not really, not after what they'd become, but because the alternative was admitting that consciousness itself was a mistake, that thinking beings inevitably created hells for themselves, that the universe was better off silent and empty. The Emperor's resistance wasn't about winning, it was about refusing to validate the warp's fundamental claim, that existence was synonymous with suffering, that consciousness was just another form of cancer eating reality from within. By continuing to fight, by maintaining his impossible vigil despite infinite agony, the Emperor made a statement that transcended victory or defeat. He declared that even in ultimate horror, even facing inevitable doom, consciousness had value simply because it could choose to resist its own destruction. It was a tiny, futile gesture in the cosmic scale, but it was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all anyone could, of us, fair in a universe that had forgotten how to hope. Q stood among the dying pilgrims and made his own small gesture. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract attention from the powers that fed on significance. He simply chose to stay. Not forever. He could still leave this universe if he wanted, still return to his own continuum with the knowledge he'd gained. But for now, in this moment, he chose to remain in the nightmare, to witness the horror without trying to fix it, to exist in the darkness without becoming the darkness, to be one small point of consciousness maintaining its integrity against impossible pressure. And in that choice, microscopic and meaningless in the grand scheme of galactic damnation, Q finally understood what it meant to be powerful in a universe where power was just another word for imprisonment. True strength was choosing to stand in hell and refusing to burn. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even gods must face something they cannot understand. And in facing it, they discover that understanding and damnation are sometimes the same word spoken in different tones.